I revealed to everyone at the company party that my cheating wife's lover was her boss, and there was no time to regret it. The hall, until then full of forced laughter, formal applause and toasts disguised as camaraderie, fell into a piercing silence. A silence that tasted like metal, smelled like shame, and had the texture of free fall. She looked at me with wide eyes, as if she didn't understand what was happening, as if I had gone crazy. But I knew. I knew everything. Not just betrayal. But every detail, every meeting, every hastily deleted message, every perfume changed before returning home. I knew she slept with him. With the man who for years shook my hand at corporate events, looked me in the eye as he planned to grow at my expense and at the expense of the woman I loved. I knew she had chosen to give herself up, not once, not on impulse, but consciously, planned, almost meticulously. And even though I knew, even though I had all the proof, I still hesitated. Because pain is not a sudden explosion. It seeps in like a slow poison. I watched her fake love the nights she hugged me after a supposed extra meeting. I saw her smile at me with eyes that no longer saw me. And I accepted. For weeks, I swallowed my tears in the bathroom, disguised my despair in glasses of cheap wine and pretended that the lies weren't so many. I pretended out of fear. Because loving someone who betrays you is worse than being betrayed. It's feeling ashamed for having loved too much, for having trusted beyond what was acceptable. It's blaming yourself for not being enough, even when you gave it your all. When I confronted the two of them, when I made that venomous toast in front of everyone, every word that came out of my mouth was like a shard of glass piercing my throat. I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it for justice. And, perhaps, to wake up from the nightmare that turned my life around. She tried to speak. He tried to create a more acceptable version of the ruin itself. He said it was a mistake, that it wasn't quite like that, that they were confused, that everything had happened, when we were in crisis. But we weren't. We were laughing together a few days ago. We were trying to have a baby. We were buying a bigger apartment. We were, at least for my part, building a future. She spoke, and he remained silent. Coward. The type of man who seduces other people's wives and then hides behind positions and status. The kind of man who thinks the world is his until the world turns against him. Her gaze begged for mercy. But the only thing I could offer was the truth. And I gave everyone the truth. Out loud. In front of their wives, their colleagues, their customers. Faced with the mirror of the corporate world where betrayal was more common than a salary increase. In the days that followed, she tried to look for me. He tried to reappear like someone looking for the pieces of a broken vase to glue together and pretend it never fell. She tried to remind me of the good things. From travel. From dinners. The first time we said, "I love you." But there was no longer any memory capable of sustaining that. The image of her naked on my cell phone screen, laughing next to him on a hotel bed, had erased any nostalgia. And yet, even in the face of destruction, she still thought she could return. That I would forgive her because I'm too good, because she made a mistake, because it was just a moment of weakness. But there is no weakness in someone who plans a meeting after hours, who lies about where they are, who kisses another mouth and goes home talking about fidelity. This is not weakness. It's cruelty. What she didn't know, what he didn't know either, was that that moment at the party was just the beginning. The beginning of true hell. Because those who betray do not expect the betrayed to react intelligently. They expected scandal, screams, maybe a slap. But they didn't expect the coldness with which I explained everything. They didn't expect the prints on the screens. Dates crossed with point records. The images from the building's cameras. The emails. The audios. The messages she deleted, but which I recovered. They didn't expect me to know. That I had recorded everything. That I had kept every piece of your lie. That I had watched every single one of the videos where she told him she never really loved me. He said that with me it was routine, but with him it was passion. That with me it was an obligation, and with him it was a desire. They didn't expect me to have access to the corporate email account she used to communicate with him. They didn't expect the security system of the hotel they were in to record every entry and exit. They didn't expect the corporate world to be as cruel with scandals as it is with default. But the most unexpected was yet to come. Because she tried to redeem herself. He tried to reach me when it was too late. And in trying to get back to me, he found the ultimate revelation. Because from then on, I was the one who started telling the story. I, who rebuilt my life away from her, with someone who had known her for years. Someone who, in silence, already knew everything, but never said anything. Someone who kept to himself a truth that would change everything, and at the right time, decided to tell me. And this person, was someone she would never have imagined knew about the case. It was someone who watched everything up close, silent, an accomplice in my suffering. And it was this person who showed me the last recording. The last secret. The final piece of the puzzle that exposed not just the betrayal, but a second layer of lies that would change the entire narrative. A layer that made it seem like she had betrayed not just me, but herself. Because what she didn't know, was that there was someone, very close, who was watching her in silence, someone who had once heard a sentence from her that would now return as a destructive echo. And now, there's just one question left: if her lover was her boss, who was the person who knew everything from the beginning, and why did she hide that secret until the last moment? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support, encourage or romanticize any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a brutal truth: betrayal destroys homes, hearts and lives. Each narrative is a reminder that choices have consequences. Get ready, because what's next, it's not just a story, it's a reality check. Good listening. Daniel and Laura were the kind of couple who attracted attention in any room, not because of their looks or extravagance, but because of a connection that seemed solid, natural, almost enviable. Married for 8 years, they shared a life built on effort, understanding and a kind of mutual patience that is rare these days. Daniel was a project engineer at a multinational in the technology sector, a methodical, rational man, with calm speech and restrained gestures, one of those who always think twice before saying anything. Laura, on the other hand, worked in the marketing area of a large food corporation, was creative, sociable, with a sharp emotional intelligence that she knew how to use to her advantage in any room she entered. Their routine was guided by the synchronization of a well-adjusted clock. They woke up together, shared breakfast in complicit silence, and always said goodbye with a quick kiss, even if in a hurry. At night, sometimes they cooked together, other times they ordered something and settled on the sofa, commenting on each other's day, laughing at the peculiarities of work or the small human failings they observed around them. The house where they lived was a reflection of the life they tried to lead: comfortable, cozy, with details carefully chosen by Laura and organized by Daniel. Each room had a story, from the crooked picture that they insisted on not adjusting to the lamp bought on impulse on a rainy weekend. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a building with few units and discreet neighbors. They had a solid network of friends, built over affinity and time, and their monthly meetings were marked by board games, average wines and conversations that ranged from politics to fashion series. In anyone's eyes, there was nothing wrong with that couple. Laura, with her lightness and easy smile, enchanted her colleagues at work and won over clients with a firm and empathetic attitude. Daniel, even though he was more introspective, knew how to position himself and was respected for leading with clarity and consistency. They had a comfortable, stable life, without major ups and downs, which, for many, was already a reason to envy. Their marriage was not impulsive. They dated for 4 years before deciding to get married, and planning their life together involved long conversations, shared spreadsheets and silent agreements about what they wanted and what they wouldn't tolerate. Neither of them were given to large public displays of affection, but at home, there was affection. The kind of affection that manifests itself in covering the other person when they sleep on the couch, in leaving the coffee ready before going out, in knowing the right song to play when the day has been bad. They argued little, but when they did, they knew exactly where to hit. They never slept fighting, but there were long, strategic silences that said more than words. And even with the personality differences, there was admiration. Daniel admired the way Laura knew how to conduct a meeting without seeming authoritarian, how she could transform any environment with her light presence, how she read people with surgical precision. Laura, in turn, admired Daniel's serenity, his ability to reason logically even under pressure, his unshakable loyalty to his friends and his almost obsessive sense of responsibility. They had no children, by mutual decision. They wanted to enjoy life, grow professionally, travel without depending on school calendars or pediatricians. This has never been a point of conflict. Sometimes, at family dinners, they had to deal with invasive questions about, when are the grandchildren coming, but they had learned to respond with smiles and graceful evasions. In the last 2 years, they started investing more in experiences than in assets, short trips, cooking courses, meditation retreats. They seemed to want to rediscover themselves as a couple. And no matter how busy their routines were, they found time for each other, whether on a Sunday morning walk, or in silent cafes where each one read their book next to the other, without speaking, just sharing the space. Over time, however, something began to change. Subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A slight disconnection, a distraction here, a delay there. Daniel, always so attentive to details, began to notice small changes in Laura's behavior. She, previously always excited about Friday dinners, started claiming tiredness. Spontaneous laughter gave way to forced silences. The hugs, once natural, now seemed calculated. But he didn't say anything. I preferred to believe that it was a phase, that it was the stress of work, the new responsibilities, the tighter deadlines. Laura had recently been promoted, and that brought an extra burden that justified everything. At least that's what he told himself. I didn't want to be invasive. It never was. He trusted her with the same conviction as he believed in gravity. It was a principle, not a possibility. Laura, in turn, felt growing uneasiness. He wasn't unhappy. But she also didn't feel full. There was a strange feeling, as if she were living a version of herself that no longer represented her completely. She liked Daniel, admired him deeply, but something inside her seemed suspended. It was as if a part of you was in hibernation. Work began to consume more than your time, it began to consume your attention, your energy, your thoughts. The couple's routine, once comfortable, now bored her. Conversations became predictable, gestures of affection automatic. She felt suffocated not by a lack of freedom, but by an excess of stability. The feeling of security she had always sought now worried her. It was a paradox that was difficult to explain. And, as I didn't know how to put it into words, I simply remained silent. At the company, Laura was seen as one of the most promising leaders. He had charisma, consistent results and a solid network of contacts. Her new position placed her closer to senior management, which required her to take an even more strategic and, at the same time, more political stance. Dinners with clients, meetings with investors and corporate events have become part of the routine. And with them, came the inevitable approximations. People with interests, with subtle power games, with looks that said more than words. Laura adapted easily. She knew how to move around in these environments, how to be respected without seeming unapproachable. But she never failed to notice how much this new universe gradually took her away from the simplicity of the life she had with Daniel. It was as if he lived in two parallel worlds. Daniel noticed the growing distance, but refused to confront it. Not out of fear of Laura, but out of fear of what he might hear. I preferred to hold on to the good times, the memories of the beginning, the promises made between one sip of wine and the next. He was the type of man who believes that everything is resolved with time, that true love overcomes bad phases, that dialogue, sooner or later, is necessary. So it was still the same. He cooked dinner on Tuesdays, washed the dishes on Thursdays, bought her the wine she liked and left notes on the mirror. But Laura, increasingly absorbed in her new universe, barely understood. And when I realized, I felt guilty. A silent, corrosive guilt that made her repay with hasty gestures, with carefully chosen words, with well-intentioned apologies. Despite everything, there was still affection between them. There were still nights when they looked at each other and remembered why they were together. There were still moments when the touch was genuine, when the laughter was spontaneous. But these were increasingly rare moments, swallowed up by a routine that no longer seemed to have the energy to reinvent itself. They knew. Each one, in their own way, knew. But they pretended they didn't know. And they continued like that, with synchronized steps in opposite directions, sharing a bed, but sleeping in different worlds. Until the day the company party was scheduled. A formal event, full of speeches, ambient music and mechanically raised glasses. It was supposed to be just another night of corporate protocol. But it turned out to be the beginning of the end. Or, who knows, the end of the pretense. Laura had slowly transformed into an almost mythical figure within the company. His name was circulated among the departments with respect, sometimes with envy, sometimes with silent admiration. His professional behavior was impeccable, and his natural elegance only accentuated the authority he imposed without raising his voice. He knew exactly when to smile, when to back away, when to tease. In everyone's eyes, she was the type of woman who achieved everything lightly. But behind each calculated movement, there was a growing tiredness. It was as if she were on a stage, acting in a play that she had written years before, but which no longer made sense. Marriage, work, goals, meetings with colleagues, everything went on as if each detail was just another item on an endless checklist. Daniel continued his usual pace, without showing much of what he felt, but attentive. He was far from being a disconnected man, and even without saying it, he noticed the growing disconnect. Her messages became less frequent during work hours, dinners for two became rare exceptions. Work trips began to coincide with weekends that were previously sacred. He watched the details change, the perfumes on the shelf, the time spent in the mirror before going out, the artificial glow and the smile that was once genuine. And yet, I would rather shut up. He believed that if he insisted on loving patiently, perhaps the cracks would disappear. Maybe it really was a phase. Maybe she was just rediscovering herself, as she had said so many times in other conversations, when she talked about tiredness or the need to feel alive. Within the corporate environment, a name began to appear more frequently alongside Laura. Edward. Regional director, experienced, respected, and owner of a striking presence. He had a charismatic leadership style and, like many men in high positions, had become accustomed to being listened to without being challenged. He was the type of figure who commanded respect, but who knew how to soften authority with charm. He was never overtly seductive, but he knew how to explore the subtle game of the gaze, the attention offered at the exact moment, the veiled compliment that could not be considered inappropriate. Laura began to approach him first out of professional obligation. Alignment meetings, pair presentations, trips to visit branches. Then, because of the ease I felt when talking to him. Eduardo listened to her in a way that Daniel no longer did. He asked questions that awakened something in her that she thought she had forgotten. It wasn't just desire. It was recognition. It was to be seen. At first, Laura set invisible boundaries. That type of flirting disguised as mutual respect, which is halfway between what is permitted and what is prohibited. But Eduardo, with the experience of someone who knew exactly how to act, pushed these limits with the delicacy of someone serving a glass of wine at dinner. And she, little by little, gave in. First with smiles that lasted too long. Then with messages that went beyond what was necessary. Finally, with meetings at times when no one else was around. It all started as an escape. A space where Laura could breathe without the weight of expectations. With Eduardo, she didn't need to pretend that everything was fine. And it was addictive. The problem is that this type of relief comes at a high price, especially when you have a structured life with someone who trusts you blindly. The first time they touched was at a hotel in another state, during a conference. They had finished a corporate dinner, and Eduardo walked her to the bedroom door. They stayed there for long seconds, in silence, as if the two were asking each other for permission to cross an invisible line. Laura hesitated, said she was tired, that she had an early presentation. He smiled understandingly, but before turning around, he held your hand for a few seconds. And it was with that touch that it all really began. The following night was inevitable. A hotel room, two bodies in silence, guilt muffled by kisses and empty promises. When she returned home, Laura felt the weight of a world that she herself was beginning to destroy. But Daniel welcomed her with a simple dinner and a look so light that she almost cried. Almost. He didn't cry. He just smiled, pretended, and surrendered to the normality of someone who doesn't want to arouse suspicion. What Laura didn't know was that Daniel had noticed. He noticed the way her smell changed after trips. How your clothes came back folded differently. How your eyes took half a second longer to hold his. But instead of confronting, he observed. He started researching. To understand. Retracing her steps over the last few months. And the more he dived, the more he felt himself sinking. Each discovery was a silent stab, a confirmation that love alone is not enough when the desire to betray has already taken up too much space. Daniel was not impulsive. He wasn't vindictive. But he had an almost obsessive need to understand. So he kept everything. Every clue, every gesture that confirmed his suspicions. I knew I couldn't act immediately. I needed the right moment. I needed it to hurt. Not as punishment. But as naked truth. At the same time, Laura was experiencing an internal conflict that tore her apart. The desire for Eduardo grew at the same time that the guilt gnawed at her. In the moments when I was with Daniel, I felt the distance like a concrete barrier. I couldn't play him with the same delivery anymore. I no longer felt desire. And that made her feel even dirtier. I knew I was destroying something real for something that, deep down, I didn't even know if it was true. Eduardo said he admired her, that she was special, that she deserved more. But he was also married. He also had his own facade of perfection. The affair, although intense, was hidden, contained in sporadic meetings, in deleted messages, in silent promises of, one day, maybe. And the more Laura delved into this clandestine relationship, the more she realized there was no going back. The invitation to the company's annual party arrived in early December. It was one of those formal, obligatory events where all employees attended more out of pressure than out of desire. A night with speeches, toasts, and a slight tension in the air. Daniel knew it would be the perfect opportunity. I had everything ready. He had kept everything. He had chosen words with surgical precision. It wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about justice. It wasn't about pain anymore. It was about revelation. Laura, in turn, hesitated to invite him. But he, with his usual restrained smile, insisted on going. He said he wanted to support her, that he was proud of her growth. And she, without the courage to deny it, accepted. Daniel's presence that night weighed like a constant reminder of who she was, or who she pretended to be. That night, he wore his best suit, combed his hair precisely, and arrived a few minutes early, as he always did. He observed every detail. Laura's every gesture when greeting her colleagues. Every exchange of glances. Every subtle movement that confirmed everything he already knew. She tried to stand her ground, but her expression betrayed a discomfort that was difficult to hide. Eduardo, in turn, acted as if nothing was out of place. He distributed greetings, smiles, made discreet jokes and toasted as if he were just another successful executive. But Daniel already knew everything. I knew where those coded messages came from. He knew which trips had been covered up with frivolous excuses. I knew the room number. The name used on the reservation. He knew more than she could imagine. When he took the stage to make a toast in honor of the company's leaders, Daniel received a polite applause. But no one knew what he would say. Not even Laura. Not even Eduardo. With a firm smile and controlled voice, he began with formal praise. He spoke of goals achieved, of partnerships established, of shared achievements. Until, in an almost imperceptible turn of speech, he changed his tone. He talked about trust. Of ethics. How difficult it is to build a solid reputation, and how easy it is to destroy it. And then, with the lightness of someone telling a banal story, he said that in that same room, there were two professionals who had broken all possible codes. And, as he raised his glass, he finished his toast by revealing that the woman with whom he shared his life, his plans, his home, was her boss's lover. And that was the last time he saw them with eyes of naivety. Laura froze. Edward looked away. And for an instant, the hall was plunged into deafening silence. Everyone looked around trying to understand if this was a joke. But the expression on Daniel's face left no doubt. It was the cruelest of truths. And the night, which began with promises and celebrations, ended with accusing looks, hurried steps and exposed secrets. But there was still something no one knew. Something that would make everything even worse. And that was yet to come. Laura left the party without looking back, swallowed by the shame of a public exposure she had never imagined facing. Eduardo, at his side, maintained an upright posture, but the sweat on the back of his neck betrayed his nervousness. The two walked in silence to the parking lot. She wanted to scream, ask why Daniel had done that, but the words wouldn't come out. Inside the car, Eduardo was the first to break the silence with a dry, almost mechanical sentence, trying to maintain control. He had no right to do that, it was cruel. Laura laughed, a short, humorless laugh. Said he only told the truth. That there was no greater cruelty than the lie experienced in recent months. That maybe, deep down, she deserved it. Eduardo glanced at her but didn't respond. There was an atmosphere of rupture in the air, as if what had united them until then had crumbled with the crash of a glass amidst forced applause. The next morning, Daniel was not at home. He had left the keys on the kitchen table, along with an envelope with his name on it. Inside, just a letter, a single sheet, handwritten, with calm strokes, as if it had been written during a long afternoon of silence. Laura sat on the sofa with the letter in her hands, her fingers shaking, and her heart pounding. As he began to read, he felt as if each word weighed tons. He spoke with painful clarity about what he had witnessed, what he had discovered, but most of all about what he had felt. The pain of lying next to someone who was no longer there. The agony of loving without being loved in return. The feeling of being invisible. But the end of the letter was what left her breathless. There, he said that betrayal was not the worst part. That what had really torn him apart was finding out who knew about the betrayal from the beginning, and kept quiet. That what hurt now was not the infidelity, but the complicity disguised as empathy that surrounded her. And now, he knew everything. Including those who helped her keep the theater going. The last words were cryptic but devastating, "You will know who you are. And when you do, I hope you feel half of what I felt." Laura froze. He reread the letter, trying to understand. Who? Who knew? Who else was part of the hoax? He spent the day trying to call Daniel, but he didn't answer. I sent messages, begged for a conversation, a meeting, a chance to explain. But he disappeared. He disappeared in a way that only someone injured can disappear. And then, at the end of that week, she received the visit she never expected. A sultry afternoon, the blinds were half open, and a doorbell sounded like a sentence. When he opened the door, there was Mariana. Co-worker. Close friend. Confidant. Someone who Laura considered almost like a sister within the company. Mariana was visibly shaken, her eyes red, the expression of someone carrying more than she should. He said he needed to talk, that he could no longer keep it bottled up. They sat on the porch. Laura offered tea, but Mariana refused. He remained silent for a few minutes, looking at the ground, before finally looking up. And when he spoke, The words fell like stones on Laura's body. Mariana knew about the betrayal from the beginning. I knew about every meeting, every excuse, every extra hour invented. She knew why, a month before the case began, Eduardo had sought her out first. He said he admired her work, that he thought she was brilliant. And he tried to seduce her. Mariana firmly refused. But it was at that moment that he noticed the pattern. That he did this often. That tested limits. And that, when Laura started to rise professionally, she saw it. He saw the looks. The disguised touches. The laughter contained at the end of meetings. And then, the coincidental disappearances. Emails with garbled words. He saw it and was silent. Not out of malice. But out of fear. I was afraid of losing my job. Fear of being involved. Fear of becoming a target. But what no one knew, and what Mariana now told through tears, was that she didn't just know. She had been used. Eduardo had asked her to distract Daniel during an event, months earlier, with a false invitation to a side project, trying to keep him away from the trip where Laura and he would make their first presentation together. Mariana didn't know why at the time, she just followed orders. But then he understood. And when he understood, he tried to move away. He tried to subtly warn Laura, but she didn't notice. Mariana watched everything fall apart from afar. And now, seeing Laura's life fall apart, he could no longer bear the guilt. Laura, listening to all that, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Eduardo's betrayal hurt, but Mariana's silent complicity, someone she trusted, was like a blow in the back. What Mariana didn't know, and what Laura then revealed, with a trembling voice and an empty look, was that Daniel already knew about her participation. I knew she had been a piece in the game. And that he had prepared something. Something bigger. Mariana turned pale. I said I didn't know what he would do, that I didn't want any more problems. But Laura didn't respond. He just got up, picked up the letter again, and reread the last paragraph. 2 days later, a video was emailed to the company's board of directors, the press and key sponsors. The video was clear, direct, with dates, hotel entry records, internal images, messages exchanged, and excerpts from conversations that demonstrated favor within the professional environment. It showed how Eduardo used his position to benefit Laura, and how Mariana had been instrumentalized. The consequences were immediate. Eduardo was removed, an internal process was opened, and Laura was placed on leave. Mariana resigned even before the first HR meeting. But the worst was yet to come. The following week, Laura received a call from an investigative journalist. The woman was direct. She wanted to know if Laura confirmed that Eduardo had used his relationship with her to manipulate the company's financial decisions, something that was now being investigated as a corporate crime. Laura denied it, in shock. I had no idea. The journalist said that, according to sources, the involvement between the two went back much further than she thought. That Eduardo used women to maintain internal control, and that Laura was not the first. But perhaps it would be the last. It was then that Laura understood the true meaning of Daniel's letter. What he knew was not just betrayal. It was that she had been used. That Eduardo, the man she became emotionally involved with, never loved her. That everything was manipulated to keep her close, loyal, distracted. That she was a piece. Bait. Victim. And that the ruin of their marriage was just collateral damage in a much bigger plan. Daniel knew, because he discovered everything by hiring a private investigator. I knew before the party. He kept everything. Calculated everything. And he exposed everything. With surgical precision. No screaming. No scandals. Just facts. And at that moment, alone in the room, holding her cell phone with the content open, Laura finally cried. He cried like he had never cried before. Not because of the destroyed marriage. Not because of the ruined career. but for realizing that what she thought was love had been, from the beginning, an even bigger lie than the one she told herself. And there was still something left, that Daniel had not revealed. Something that would change not only the past, but the future. That night when Laura came to her senses ended without sleep, without direction and without escape. He woke up in the morning with his face swollen and his throat raw from trying so hard to contain what was no longer containable. The house was empty and suffocating, as if the furniture stared at her with mute judgment. She spent hours walking from one room to another without purpose, until she decided to go after the only person who could perhaps offer her an explanation, even if bitter. He knew where to find Daniel. He would never run away from the pain. He was the kind of man who faced it, who dealt with it, who felt it until the end. And if there was any chance of understanding why he had been silent for so long and then exploded so surgically, she needed to look into his eyes one last time. Not for forgiveness. She no longer felt worthy of it. But because there was something I still didn't understand, something denser than anything I had discovered so far. He drove to the old studio he used to go to on Saturday afternoons. A discreet space, where he met with a group of engineer friends for side projects, strong coffee and long conversations about technology and innovation. A place that Laura had always found boring, but which now seemed to be the last link that could still lead her to it. When she arrived, she saw his car parked and hesitated before getting out. I didn't know what I would say. He no longer had the right to ask anything. But he went to the door and knocked. The one who opened it was an older man, an acquaintance of Laura, who looked at her with restrained surprise. He said Daniel was in the back, alone, and had asked not to be disturbed. But upon hearing her voice, Daniel appeared. His face no longer carried pain. It was another kind of expression, a mixture of relief and detachment. As if I no longer expected anything from her. And that hit her more than any scream. They were silent for long seconds until Laura finally spoke. He said he knew everything. What Mariana had told. That the videos ended up in the press. That the scandal became headlines. But what she wanted to know was why. Why didn't he confront her sooner? Why did you wait so long? Why did you expose everything like that? Daniel listened without interrupting, and when he responded, his voice was firm, but without hatred. He said he waited because he still had hope. If he had confronted her before, perhaps she would deny it, lie, make him seem crazy. He said he needed to be sure. Not just from the betrayal, but from how much she had lost herself. And when he saw how much she believed in the role she played with Eduardo, he knew there was no going back. Laura tried to interrupt, saying that she felt deceived by everyone, including herself, but Daniel just looked at her with a look that no longer sought understanding. And then he said what she hadn't expected to hear. She revealed that she knew of Eduardo's involvement with other employees before her. That he had proof. That Mariana hadn't told everything. That, in fact, he was the one who came to her first, to warn her. That Mariana had refused Eduardo out of respect for him, Daniel, and that it was she who recommended the investigator. He said that everything Laura experienced was not just a romantic betrayal, it was also professional, emotional and institutional manipulation. She said the scandal she thought had started at the party had been in motion long before. And that he only finished what he started when he realized that he had lost not only the woman he loved, but the very place of trust in her life. She tried to defend herself, saying that she didn't know any of this, that she believed that Eduardo really saw her as someone special, but Daniel interrupted with a restrained gesture. I didn't want to hear justifications. He said he didn't blame her for feeling needy, for seeking excitement, for doubting marriage. But that she chose someone who, from the beginning, saw her as just a piece. He said that the most painful thing was not that she gave herself to another man, but rather the fact that she let that other man redefine her, transform her into a version of herself that he, Daniel, did not recognize. She said that, at some point, she stopped being Laura, and became just another extension of Eduardo's plans. Laura cried without being able to contain it. She said that all she wanted now was to go back in time, stop herself from answering that first call, delete every message, avoid every step. Daniel just shook his head. He said that time doesn't come back, and that he learned to accept that. He said that what she needed now was not him, but herself. And that, if one day he recognized himself in the mirror again, perhaps he could rebuild himself. But he had already started again. And then came the final blow. Daniel said he was no longer alone. That there was someone. He didn't say names, he didn't give details. But he said that this person had helped him understand everything clearly, that he had shown that he was still capable of being loved without having to beg for attention. He said he didn't know what the future held, but he was finally breathing easy. And that, if Laura really wanted to understand everything, she should talk to the only person who knew the truth from the beginning. Laura was confused. He asked who it was. Daniel looked into her eyes for a few seconds and then spoke, with the calmness of someone who no longer needs to win, his own sister. Laura was left without a reaction. He said that was impossible. That the sister had never said anything. That I would never realize. But Daniel confirmed it. He said it was she who approached him a month before the party. Who always had a backbone with Eduardo. Who knew old stories, from other companies. That, seeing the two together, he smelled danger. He said that his sister did not want to interfere immediately out of respect, but that, upon noticing that Laura was blind, she decided to act. Laura left the studio unable to walk properly. My head was spinning, my thoughts were running over each other. He called his sister. The call was answered coldly. The conversation was short, but sufficient. She confirmed. He said he tried to warn. Who tried to talk? That Laura didn't want to hear. Who fell in love with his own illusion. He said the price of ignoring the signs always comes. And that she, as a sister, could no longer do anything. And hung up. In the following days, Laura was plunged into absolute silence. Social networks are gone. The phone went silent. The house, dark. Eduardo was officially fired. A criminal case was opened. The company made headlines. And she became a footnote on portals that only cared about scandals. Daniel, in turn, continued his life with discretion. Changed address. Changed routine. Resumed old projects. And next to someone who, unlike Laura, listened to him with silent attention and eyes that didn't lie, he began to understand that sometimes the deepest pain is the gateway to a peace that we would never have known without it. Time passed. And Laura, finally, decided to leave home. He walked to a nearby square and sat on the bench he used to frequent with Daniel in the first months of their marriage. He looked around and felt such an emptiness that he thought about screaming. But he didn't scream. He just closed his eyes, and, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to be a real person again. Not a piece. Not a role. Just someone who learns from what they lose. Because, at that moment, she understood that the greatest betrayal was not against Daniel. It was against herself. And that, there was no way to expose it in public. This was the one she would have to face alone. Every day. Until the end. In the days following the climactic revelation, a new kind of silence took over Laura's life. It was no longer the silence of fear, omission, or escape. It was the silence of realization. She no longer needed to run around looking for answers, because now she had them all. And what was left was dealing with the echo of these responses in every detail of everyday life that previously seemed harmless. The house, which for years had been the scene of a stable life, now seemed like an uninhabitable place. The pictures on the walls seemed to depict memories of someone she was no longer. The clothes in the closet, the books on the shelf, the objects in the drawers, everything had become a harsh reminder of a version of herself that had been completely unmasked. Laura didn't sleep, didn't eat, and didn't answer calls anymore. I only heard the noise of the news being gradually forgotten. The scandal, so violent and eye-catching when it came to light, began to be replaced by new scandals, new distractions, and soon it stopped making headlines. But being forgotten by the world was no consolation. It was a sentence. The company issued an official note with carefully chosen words, assuring stakeholders that the necessary measures had been taken, that the corporate culture would be reviewed, that everything was an isolated incident. Eduardo disappeared from public life. They said he had moved to another state, that he was trying to negotiate a silent plea deal to avoid a harsher sentence. Mariana, despite the guilt she carried, managed to retrace her trajectory in another sector, away from the eyes of those who knew her. But Laura had nowhere to run. Her image was linked to the error, to the name she had created with her own hands. There was nowhere else to hide other than within herself. And this was the most hostile place of all. For weeks, she avoided any attempt to reconnect with the past. She did not respond to messages from her mother, who begged for a visit. He ignored the few friends who still dared to show compassion. I also avoided the mirror. Every time she saw herself reflected, all she could see was the expression of someone who hurt, who destroyed something true in the name of an illusion. There was no longer any justification that made sense. Not even the feeling of abandonment or frustration that had led her to Eduardo. Everything now seemed like a cheap excuse given the damage it caused. But what tormented her most was not the loss of Daniel, nor even the public humiliation. It was the memory of his look when he said he had already started a new story. A look that didn't carry anger. There was no disgust. There was something much more painful, indifference. Over time, Laura forced herself to leave the house. He needed to pay bills, he needed to breathe air that wasn't trapped between the walls of his mistakes. She began to frequent cafes far from where she was known, she began to walk the streets like a stranger avoiding her own reflection in shop windows. She got a temporary job, in a small consultancy, where no one recognized her. She worked quietly, efficiently, discreetly. He never talked about his personal life. It was just another face among many. And that, for a while, was all she needed. But solitude, even chosen, exacts a price. And one night, walking home, he felt on the verge of something he couldn't name. He sat on the sidewalk, in front of the building where he lived, and cried. Not because of the pain. But for the total absence of anything that looked like hope. It was in this state that she decided to write a letter. Not for Daniel. But for herself. A letter where you could put everything you never had the courage to say. She described every feeling, every doubt, every regret with an honesty that made her tremble as she wrote. She said she had loved wrongly, chosen poorly, betrayed herself before betraying anyone else. She confessed that for a long time she believed she was the protagonist of a romantic story, when in fact she was just another part of a cruel script. She admitted that she tried to be modern, strong, independent, but in practice she acted like someone weak, cowardly and needy. At the end of the letter, he wrote a single sentence that seemed to sum it all up: I wanted to go back to being someone you would be proud to know. The next day, Laura decided to deliver the letter. Not directly to Daniel. But to his sister. He looked up his address, went there and waited. When the woman opened the door, she didn't say anything. He just handed over the envelope, apologized with a restrained wave, and left. I knew I might never get an answer. But I felt like I needed to leave that chapter behind once and for all. She needed someone to know that she understood. That she felt. That she accepted the consequences. What he didn't know was that that gesture would be the first step in something that would change the course of history once again. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued with a discreet fluidity, like someone stepping onto familiar ground after crossing a minefield. He was not fooled by the idea of a quick cure. I knew that some wounds never heal completely. But I had learned to live with them without bleeding. He spent his days with more purpose, and his nights, previously empty, were now filled with calm conversations, simple dinners, and the company of someone who, even without promising anything, offered presence. She didn't ask too many questions. Don't invade. It was just there. And that quiet stability was all Daniel needed at the moment. When the sister received Laura's letter, she hesitated for days before handing it over. He read the contents, wept discreetly, and then decided to send a copy to Daniel, along with a short message: "Maybe you need to read this. Or maybe not. But I thought you should have the option." It took a week to open. And when he did, it wasn't the pain that came back. It was confirmation that he had done the right thing. The right choice. Because for once, he didn't feel guilty. And for the first time, he understood that Laura, despite all her mistakes, had finally faced herself. That didn't erase the past. But it gave meaning to the path taken. The dilemma that now arose for Daniel was not whether he would return to Laura. This was already defined. But he would forgive himself for not having seen it before. For insisting so much. For having believed for too long in a story that was already doomed to failure from the moment she stopped listening to it. And at that point, he realized that true redemption does not come from others. It comes from our ability to start over without wanting to erase what happened. Because every pain, every loss, every scar, it all makes up who we are. And although some stories end in ruin, others are born exactly from what's left of the wreckage. After a month, Laura decided to sell the apartment. Not as an escape. But as liberation. He knew he couldn't start over in a place where every wall carried echoes of broken promises. She bought a small property, in a different neighborhood, further away, where no one knew who she was. He started studying again, took short courses, and little by little he found some spark of curiosity about life. I avoided thinking about Daniel often. But when I thought about it, it was no longer with guilt. It was with longing. A longing that did not seek return, but that recognized the importance of what they experienced. A love that, even betrayed, was real. And that, even though he was injured, he had left something intact, the ability to remember him with respect. And it is at this point that the story begins to prepare its outcome. Because despite everything, there was a question that still hung in the air, shrouded in silence and memories: is it possible to completely rebuild yourself after having destroyed your own foundation? Is it possible that, even with no return, there are paths that lead to peace? Or were some brands made to remember, and not disappear? It was on a gray March afternoon, one of those days when the sky seems to be dragging with it the weight of all unresolved stories, that Laura finally decided to accept the invitation of the community therapist she visited once a week in her new neighborhood. The invitation was to a listening and expression group, a safe space where strangers gathered to share fragments of life, accumulated pain in discrete victories. At first, she was reluctant. Pride still burned at the edges of his skin, and the shame of telling his story in front of strangers was almost paralyzing. But that afternoon, when he looked out the window and realized that he had spent almost 4 months without talking in depth to anyone, he understood that isolation was no longer serving him as a shelter, but rather as a prison. She walked to the community center with slow steps, the wind pushing her hair back as if the universe wanted to free her from the stiffness she still carried in her shoulders. The group was small, made up of ordinary people, faces marked by time, by the silent battle of maintaining their own sanity in a world that demands resilience beyond what is natural. A woman talked about losing her husband to Alzheimer's, a young man narrated his struggle with drug addiction, a woman described the emptiness after her children grew up and moved away without leaving a trace of affection. And when it was Laura's turn, she hesitated. She looked at the ground for long seconds, felt her heart sink, but then she looked up and began to speak. He didn't say names, he didn't mention positions or dates. But he spoke of the love that became mist, the choice that became a trap, the lie that wrapped itself around his neck like a necklace of thorns. He said that he had been an accomplice in his own fall, and that he was now trying to understand if it was still possible to get up. The words came out little by little, choked, but each one brought a release. And in the end, no one judged her. On the contrary, one of the women approached and, with a delicate gesture, held his hand and said that it took courage to admit that he made the wrong choice. Laura left that meeting with a lighter chest, not because she had found absolution, but because she finally realized that she was not the only one carrying ghosts. That night, he slept for the first time without suffocating remorse. Sleep came like a shy but firm visitor. And in the dreams, for the first time in a long time, there was no despair. There was only the sound of unfamiliar voices offering understanding. Meanwhile, Daniel followed his routine with almost mathematical precision. He divided his days between work, night classes that he had decided to resume as a way of feeding his mind, and walks with his wife who, little by little, began to occupy an increasingly intimate space. She didn't ask too many questions, and that lightness was what enchanted him most. It was not about replacement, much less about oblivion. It was something else. A new chance to exist alongside someone who didn't expect perfection, who didn't demand answers, just presence. Simple dinners became rituals, conversations in the dim light served as a trail for nights that, finally, did not end in empty silence. Daniel allowed himself to smile without guilt. I had good days. I had plans. And that was enough. It was on one of these quiet nights that he received an unexpected call. The number was unknown, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end was Laura's mother. A woman he respected, who always treated him with affection and who, even after everything, never got directly involved in conflicts. She apologized for the call, said she knew he might not want to hear anything related to his daughter, but there was something she needed to say. He said that Laura had been hospitalized 2 days earlier, after a nervous breakdown. Nothing serious physically, but the medical team recommended emotional vigilance. He said that his daughter had not asked for him, but that, in the midst of her feverish delirium, she murmured disconnected phrases, names that were repeated in whispers. She said she didn't expect him to go there, she just thought he should know. Daniel thanked him politely for the call, hung up, and remained motionless for several minutes. He didn't know what he felt. There was no longer enough hurt to fuel anger, nor was there enough affection to justify urgent concern. But something inside him twitched. It wasn't love. It was something else. It was perhaps the remnant of humanity that still linked them by memories. He didn't tell anything to the woman with whom he now shared his days. He just said he needed to leave early the next morning. And when morning came, he drove to the hospital, without thinking much. Upon arrival, he asked not to be announced. He stood at a distance, observing through a glass the room where Laura slept, pale, fragile, like a shadow of what she once was. Didn't go in. He didn't speak to anyone. He just looked, and then left. On the way back, he understood that he no longer needed to resolve anything. It had been an essential part of his story, but it was no longer his home. Laura, on the other hand, when she woke up and found out about the brief visit, didn't cry. She just nodded, as if that ended a cycle within her. I knew he would never come back. I knew that even if there was forgiveness, there would never be a reunion. And in that recognition, he found freedom. When he was discharged, he returned to his new home with a new decision: he would start writing. Not as an attempt at redemption, but as a way of recording everything he experienced. The versions she told herself, the truths she ignored, the ruins she built and inhabited. He wanted to write not to forget, but to remember where he came from, to never again allow his consciousness to be distracted to the point of being lost again. Weeks passed. The world continued to spin, indifferent to individual dramas. Daniel deepened his relationship naturally. They started traveling together, discovered similar tastes, designed a life plan that didn't require proof of loyalty, just honest presence. Laura finished the first draft of her book. He sent it to an independent publisher, without pretense. I just wanted to give shape to the chaos. She didn't use real names, she didn't mention companies, but she was brutally honest about her emotions. The manuscript was accepted, and months later, released with a title that sounded like a farewell whisper: The Woman I Killed in Me. The launch was discreet, but the reception was surprising. Comments arrived from people who recognized themselves on the pages. People who had betrayed, who had been betrayed, who had lost themselves trying to find themselves. No criticism. No judgment. Identification only. And Laura, for the first time, felt that her pain had served a purpose. Not to erase the past, but to prevent other people from repeating their steps in the dark. One silent afternoon, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside, just a letter in familiar handwriting. It was Daniel's. Short, direct, with just one line, "I found peace when I realized you finally found yourself." She smiled. A light smile, without weight, without guilt, without pain. And you understood, at that moment, that the greatest form of forgiveness is to allow the other person to move on without you, and still want them to be happy. And that was the lesson that, so many months later, finally made sense. Because some stories don't end with a return. They end with silence. And it is in this silence that, sometimes, life flourishes. Time followed its course, as it does with everything that insists on remaining still, and the end of this story did not come like a sudden explosion, but like a tide that slowly rises, takes your feet, your chest, your breath and then, without fanfare, transforms everything. Laura saw her book reach an unexpected space among readers with fragmented realities. It didn't become a bestseller, it didn't grace shop windows, but it gained something deeper, the respect of those who saw themselves in pain and, at the same time, found the strength to carry on. The woman who once lived under the constraints of appearance and other people's validation now walked with her own steps, without needing to prove anything to anyone. I had found a silent freedom, not the kind that comes with applause, but the kind that comes from a clear conscience. He decided not to get involved with anyone else. At least not at that moment. He learned to live with his own company, to rediscover forgotten pleasures, such as preparing a dinner just for himself, reading poetry without rushing, listening to old songs without associating them with destructive memories. She rebuilt her identity little by little, like someone sewing a quilt with scraps of herself. The pain did not disappear, but it stopped being the protagonist. It became a scar. And over time, a scar turns into skin. Daniel, in turn, married the one who loved him when he no longer had the strength to show himself whole. The ceremony was small, in an open field, with few guests and no ostentation. There were no long speeches, no unrealistic promises. Just sincere looks, firm hands, and a silent pact to move forward lightly. He didn't forget Laura, nor did he want to. But he learned that loving someone doesn't necessarily mean keeping him close. True love, sometimes, is letting go. He continued his life with dignity, without carrying the role of victim or martyr. He became a part-time teacher, teaching young engineers with a passion that had not been allowed to emerge for years. On nights when the past threatened to invade, he sat on the porch, listened to instrumental music and wrote letters that he never sent. Letters in which he thanked life for showing, even in pain, that the truth liberates more than illusion consoles. Eduardo, the man who orchestrated the network of manipulations that devastated more than one relationship, paid dearly for his arrogance. The legal process moved faster than he anticipated, and investigations revealed not only favoritism toward Laura, but a series of unethical practices dating back to previous positions. He lost his prestige, his position, and with it, the casual friends who always surrounded him out of convenience. He tried to rebuild his career in another city, but his reputation preceded him. A leaked video of the scandal resurfaced months later on a corporate blog, reigniting press interest and closing doors he was trying to reopen with promises and worn-out smiles. He began to live in voluntary isolation, away from the spotlight, in a simple house in an area where no one recognized him. And there, alone, facing the reflection of someone who once believed he was untouchable, he began to understand that power is a sand castle, one wave is enough to collapse everything. Mariana, who experienced the moral dilemma of being an involuntary accomplice, found peace again through art. He left the corporate environment, moved to the countryside and started teaching theater classes to vulnerable children. It was as if, by allowing these children to find their voices, she was reclaiming her own. He never tried to justify himself publicly. But he wrote a letter that he never sent to Laura, where he said that true friendship sometimes requires courage to disappoint, because remaining silent, when you can warn, is also a form of betrayal. She moved on, but never again allowed herself to remain silent in the face of abuse disguised as charm. She became a woman with a firm stance, precise words, and empathetic listening, exactly what Laura always saw in her, but which fear prevented her from blossoming at the right time. Laura's book, over time, came into the hands of someone she never imagined touching again, Daniel's mother. It was she who, without warning, knocked on Laura's door one spring morning, holding the copy marked with small pen notes. He said that he had read each page carefully, and that even though he didn't agree with everything, he saw a rare sincerity there. He said that forgiving is not forgetting, but understanding. And that despite all the wrong choices, Laura had found a way not to hide. Before leaving, he hugged his ex-daughter-in-law with the firmness of someone who knows pain up close. And in this gesture, Laura understood that forgiveness is not a liberation that another grants, it is a gift that we give ourselves when we stop fighting against what has already happened. The last time Daniel and Laura crossed paths was by chance, at a conference on ethics and human behavior in corporate environments. She participated as a guest author, he as a speaker at a panel on rebuilding careers after personal crises. When they saw each other, there was a respectful silence between the two. There was no more hurt. There was no longing. There was only recognition. They talked for a few minutes, standing near a large glass window that reflected a clear sky. She asked if he was happy. He smiled and said, "I am whole." She replied that this was what she expected to hear. And then they said goodbye. No hugs, no excessive words. Only with the light weight of someone who finally understood the end. This story ends not with a reunion, but with the affirmation that not all love needs to last to be true. Some loves exist to teach, others to heal, and there are still those that destroy just to force us to rebuild with more awareness. Laura learned that self-love is the last anchor when everything we believed in sinks. Daniel learned that silence, when accompanied by truth, can be the most powerful response. And each one, in their own way, found a new place to live within their own history. Now I want to hear from you who followed this journey until the end. What did you think of this story? What impacted you most? Share your opinion in the comments, I really want to know how this story touched you. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Here you will find intense, human and profound stories, which show that every choice has a price, and that the truth, no matter how harsh it may be, always finds a way to emerge. Remember, this channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. On the contrary, our stories are a clear warning about the emotional and moral consequences it can cause. Thanks for being here. Until next time.